What if I told you that the end of an entire era, an era that lasted 1,000 years, was heralded not by the songs of troubadours, but by the deafening roar of a single day? The year was 1453, France. Two armies met on a field covered in mud and smoke. But this was no ordinary battle. It was a duel between two universes. The world of knightly valor, steel armor, lances, and a code of honor, against a new world that no one yet understood. A world of gunpowder, engineering, calculations, and mathematics. It was the last battle of the 100 Years' War and the first battle of the new modern world. At the head of one army stood a man who embodied a bygone era, an 80-year-old knight, hero of dozens of campaigns. He led his men forward in the same way knights had done for centuries, head-on with faith and courage, steel, and his own name. It was to be his last victory, his final triumph. Watch the video to the end to find out how new technologies wiped the very idea of knighthood off the face of the earth, why the old hero didn't even understand what weapons were fighting against him, and how that day became the first step into a new world. A world of cannons, science, and armies, ruled no longer by titles and pedigrees, but by numbers, firing range, and reload speed. What if I told you that everything you believed about the 100 Years' War isn't entirely true? We tend to think of it as a continuous series of battles between England and France. But by the 1450s, the conflict had virtually died down. It had turned into a Cold War, with both sides exhausted and incapable of decisive action. England was preoccupied with internal strife that would soon escalate into the War of the Roses. France, under the leadership of Charles II, was slowly but surely reclaiming its lands, relying more on diplomacy and sieges than open battle. It seemed that the century-long conflict would simply fade away without a grand finale. The epicenter of this smoldering confrontation was Gascony, or Aquitaine, a region in southwestern France. This land was unique. Geographically, it was part of France, but for 300 years it had been under the control of the English crown. This connection was not just a feudal formality, it was economic. Gascony, and especially its capital Bordeaux, was the center of European wine trade. The English market was the main consumer of this wine, which brought incredible prosperity to the region. The inhabitants of Bordeaux and its surroundings felt more like Gascon than French or English. But if they had to choose, their sympathies leaned toward the distant English king. English rule was light, with little interference in internal affairs, and most importantly, guaranteed stable income from trade. The French crown, on the other hand, was associated with high taxes, centralization of power, and a threat to their unique identity and wealth. They valued their autonomy and economic freedom above all else. In 1451, Charles VII's French army entered Gascony and occupied Bordeaux with relative ease. The French did not encounter serious resistance, as the English simply did not have the strength to defend such a remote possession. Charles VII promised to preserve the city's privileges, but the Gascons quickly felt the difference. French administration was heavy-handed, taxes rose, and trade with England, their main economic partner, was immediately disrupted. The prosperous region began to wither away before their eyes. Discontent grew with each passing day. The merchants, winemakers, and aristocrats of Bordeaux, whose prosperity depended directly on exports, saw their future in gloomy terms. They were not going to put up with French rule, which was destroying their way of life. Less than a year after the French conquest, secret envoys from Bordeaux traveled to London. They brought a plea for help and a promise. If England sent an army, the city would immediately rise up and open its gates to its former masters. This request found a response in England. The loss of Gascony was not only an economic disaster, but also a reputational one. A leader was needed, a symbol capable of leading this seemingly hopeless expedition, and such a man existed. His name was John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, a living legend and the most famous English commander of his time. His dispatch to Gascony was the last bet of the English crown in a centuries-old game. This region was a true economic miracle of the Middle Ages. The wealth that flowed from Bordeaux was based solely on the grapevine. Thousands of English ships arrived at the port, loading up with barrels of claret. This trade created a powerful aristocracy of merchants who had more influence than many feudal lords. Their loyalty was pragmatic. They were loyal to those who bought their goods. The French king did not drink as much wine as the English court and London taverns. That is why Charles VII's decision to integrate Gascony into his kingdom was seen as a disaster. He viewed the region as just another province to be subjugated and taxed. He did not understand that Gascony's unique economic system was a fragile mechanism that only worked in conjunction with England. Breaking this link was tantamount to economic collapse for Bordeaux. The city of Bordeaux itself was one of the largest and richest in Europe. Its population enjoyed exceptional freedoms. City self-government, low taxes, and the protection of the English fleet created almost ideal conditions for business. The Gascons viewed French knights and royal officials as barbarians who had come to destroy their world. They did not want to fight, they wanted to trade. Therefore, their appeal to England was not so much an act of feudal loyalty as a desperate business request. They asked for the return not of a king, but of a customer. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. What do you think was more important to the people of Gascony, their cultural identity or economic prosperity? Write about it in the comments. And be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss stories about how economics decided the fate of wars. Are you ready to learn the truth about a man who was the living embodiment of the Middle Ages and why his greatest strength became his greatest weakness? That man was John Talbot, 1st Earl of Shrewsbury. By 1452, he was between 75 and 80 years old, according to various estimates. In an era when the average life expectancy was barely half that, he was a living fossil, a relic of a bygone era. But he was the most formidable relic imaginable. He had spent his entire life on the battlefields of France. Talbot's name inspired terror in the French and immense respect in the English. He was known as the English Achilles, or the Scourge of France. His reputation was built on dozens of battles and sieges. He was the embodiment of the knightly ideal, incredibly brave, aggressive in attack, and always fighting in the front lines. He was a master of lightning cavalry attacks and daring assaults. His military philosophy was as simple and straightforward as a spear thrust. Talbot believed that victory was achieved through strength of spirit and personal valor. He despised cunning, trickery, and any weapon that allowed damage to be inflicted from a distance. For him, war was a contest of wills, where the strongest and bravest would prevail in fair and open combat. He was a knight to the core, and that is what made him the ideal candidate for the Gascony expedition. He was not just a general, he was a symbol of the good old England that Bordeaux longed for. When Talbot landed in Gascony in October 1452, his appearance had the effect of a bombshell. His force was small, only about 3,000 men, but his name was worth an entire army. As promised, Bordeaux immediately rose up and opened its gates to him. The French garrison was expelled. All of Gascony, inspired by the return of the legendary Old Lion, rose up against the French. The success was stunning. Within a few months, Talbot, acting with his usual energy, had recaptured most of the region. He moved quickly, taking one town after another, and the French troops retreated under his pressure. He acted in the old-fashioned way. Quick marches, surprise attacks, personal bravery, and it worked. It seemed that the chivalrous valor of one man could reverse the course of history and undo all of Charles VII's conquest. However, this string of successes had a downside. It reinforced Talbot's belief in his own infallibility and in the superiority of the old methods of warfare. He considered the French weak and incapable of decisive action. He was accustomed to his name alone causing them to retreat. He did not notice, or did not want to notice, that the French army had changed dramatically over the past 20 years. This army was no longer a feudal militia. It was a professional, standing army, paid by the king. It was well organized, disciplined, and most importantly, armed with something new. It had the most powerful and modern artillery in Europe. And this artillery was commanded not by knights, but by engineers. Talbot himself was an almost mythical figure. The soldiers idolized him. They believed that under his banner, they could not lose. He knew many of his men personally and fought side by side with them. This personal connection was the source of his strength. He led his men not by orders but by example. His gray head in the thick of battle was the best banner. His understanding of war was frozen in time, roughly at the era of the Battle of Agincourt, where English archers and dismounted knights won a great victory. He believed in the onslaught, that any defense would fall if attacked with sufficient ferocity. He did not recognize defensive tactics. For him, it was a sign of cowardice. War was about moving forward, about attacking. This philosophy was ideal for conquering cities that already wanted to surrender to him, but it was absolutely disastrous when faced with an enemy who decided not to flee. Talbot was a hero of a dying world, and he was about to clash with the vanguard of a new world. Do you think one man, even the greatest, can stop the course of history? But he was opposed by a man who did not believe in chivalry. In the next chapter, we will reveal the secrets of Jean Bureau, the master of gunpowder. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret. The army that defeated the knights was commanded not by a general, but by an accountant. The French King Charles VI was the complete opposite of Talbot. He was a pragmatist, not a warrior. He understood that the time of feudal militias was over. He relied not on knightly valor, but on organization, logistics, and technology. And the key figure in his new army was a man named Jean Bureau. Jean Bureau and his brother Gaspard were not nobles. They were representatives of the Parisian bourgeoisie. Jean began his career as a lawyer and financial official, essentially the king's accountant. He was a man of numbers, tables, and reports. In 1439, Charles VII, seeing something more in him, appointed him chief master of artillery of France. It was one of the most brilliant personnel decisions in history. Bureau approached artillery not as a soldier, but as an administrator and engineer. Before him, cannons were unreliable, of varying calibers and extremely difficult to use. Each cannon was a unique work of art, fired its own shells, and was often more dangerous to its own crew than to the enemy. Bureau immediately began a reform based on standardization. He introduced uniform calibers for guns. This meant that shells cast at one factory were compatible with guns made at another. He established centralized production of gunpowder, controlling its quality. He developed new, lighter, and more mobile gun carriages that allowed guns to be moved quickly on the battlefield. Previously, cannons were only effective during sieges, but the Bureau turned them into field weapons. He and his brothers personally inspected the foundries. They experimented with the composition of bronze to achieve greater barrel strength. They calculated trajectories and created firing tables. Jean Bureau transformed artillery from a dangerous curiosity into a precise, deadly science. He was not a knight, he was a technocrat, the first of his kind. Under his leadership, the French army acquired hundreds of new standardized guns. These were not only heavy bombards for destroying walls, but also light culverins and serpentines designed to engage enemy forces. Bureau created Europe's first professional artillery school, training gunners who knew how to load quickly, aim accurately, and coordinate fire. When Charles VII learned of the fall of Bordeaux and Talbot's successes, he did not panic. He reacted methodically. He ordered 3 armies to be assembled to suppress the Gascon rebellion. And the main striking force of these armies was not the cavalry, but Jean Bureau's artillery park. The king gave his engineer complete carte blanche. Bureau personally led the campaign. He brought with him not just cannons, but an entire system. He had hundreds of carts with ammunition, spare parts, blacksmiths, carpenters, and a team of trained engineers. His army moved more slowly than Talbot's flying squads, but it was like a steamroller that could not be stopped. It did not attack, it systematically wiped out any resistance. It was Jean Bureau who chose the site for the decisive battle. When French troops laid siege to the town of Castillon on the Dordogne River, Bureau did not prepare for a traditional medieval siege. He chose a spot near the town on the riverbank and ordered his men to dig. He was not going to storm Castillon. He was going to build a trap for Talbot. He used all his engineering skills. In a few days, his soldiers and workers created what went down in history as the artillery park. It was not just a camp, it was a real fortress, specially designed for artillery fire. It was here on this field that accountant Jean Bureau prepared to take his final exam. If you like how we reveal little-known but crucial details of history, please like this video. Guess how long it took the inhabitants of the besieged city to send a desperate call for help? In the summer of 1453, the French army under the command of Jean Bureau laid siege to the city of Castillon. It was a key point on the road to Bordeaux, and its fall would mean the end of English rule in Gascony. Messengers from Castillon managed to break through to Talbot in Bordeaux with a plea for immediate help. John Talbot was faced with a difficult choice. He could remain in fortified Bordeaux and wait for the French to come to him, or he could take a risk and give battle in the field to save Castillon. For an 80-year-old knight whose reputation was built on aggressive action, the choice was obvious. He could not allow his allies to fall without trying to save them. It was a matter of honor. He gathered all the forces at his disposal. It was an army consisting of his English veterans and a large number of Gascon knights and militiamen who had joined him. The total strength of his army was approximately 6,000 to 8,000 men. He was confident in his men and, most importantly, in himself. He still believed that the French feared his name and would not withstand a direct attack. On July 16, 1453, Talbot marched out of Bordeaux. He moved at a speed incredible for his age. He wanted to take the French by surprise. His vanguard, consisting of mounted knights and archers, made a forced march and arrived early in the morning of July 17th at a monastery near Castillon. The main forces, including the infantry, were several hours behind. The soldiers were exhausted from the night march. They had not eaten since the previous day. The officers advised Talbot to give his men a rest, wait for the main forces to arrive, and conduct reconnaissance. But the old lion was impatient. At that moment, a messenger from the city rode up to him with a message that proved fateful. The messenger claimed that the French were retreating. This messenger had seen a large group of people leaving the French camp. He did not know that these were not soldiers, but numerous servants, market vendors, and other camp personnel, whom Jean Bureau had prudently sent to the rear before the battle began. But for the messenger, and more importantly for Talbot, it was a clear sign. The French were afraid of his arrival and were fleeing. For Talbot, it was a signal to act, the moment for his crowning blow. He saw the picture before him, a fleeing, demoralized enemy that only needed to be overtaken and overturned with a decisive attack. He was afraid of letting them get away. He ignored the advice of his commanders and ignored the fatigue of his men. He gave the order to attack immediately. This decision was based on false information and reinforced by his own self-confidence. He did not conduct reconnaissance. He did not know that the French were not simply fleeing, but were waiting for him in the most deadly trap imaginable. He did not know that ahead of him lay not a camp, but a veritable fortress. He personally led his cavalry and dismounted knights forward. It was a classic medieval attack, lords and knights in front, followed by archers and infantry. They advanced on an enemy they thought they had almost defeated. They shouted, "Oh, for Talbot! For St. George!" They reached the open plateau in front of the French positions. Only then did they see what awaited them. It was not a camp in disarray from retreat. It was a long, bristling line of fortifications. What was Talbot's reaction when he realized his mistake? In the next chapter, you will learn exactly how the French prepared their deadly trap. Jean Bureau was an engineer, not a knight. When he chose the position for his camp, he was guided not by a code of honor, but by tactical calculation and ballistics. He located his camp on a ridge that dominated the surrounding terrain. On one side, it was protected by the Dordogne River, a tributary of the Dordogne, making it impossible to flank. On the other sides, he created a masterpiece of field fortification. The camp was unlike a traditional medieval fortification. It was designed specifically for artillery. A deep and wide moat was dug around the perimeter. The excavated earth was used to build a high rampart, which was reinforced with a palisade of sharpened logs. This rampart was uneven, with special projections and platforms, creating what would later be called bastions. But the main feature of this camp was what was hidden behind the rampart. Jean Bureau placed his main argument there, 300 cannons. It was an unprecedented concentration of artillery in such a narrow area. The guns were not placed randomly. They were grouped into batteries, each of which had its own firing sector. Bureau had already tested the area in front of the camp. These were the most modern guns of their time. Bronze culverins and serpentines fired not only stone, but also iron cannonballs. They were relatively light, which allowed their angle of fire to be changed quickly. Most importantly, thanks to standardization and trained crews, they could fire quickly and in a coordinated manner. This was no longer siege artillery, but field artillery. Bureau turned his camp into one giant firing point. Anyone who decided to attack this fortification head-on would first have to cross open ground under the crossfire of 300 barrels. Then they would have to cross a deep moat and climb a high, slippery rampart where French infantry awaited them. Inside the camp, there was no nightly chaos, but rather engineering order. Ammunition was neatly stacked. Barrels of gunpowder were protected from accidental sparks. Calculations were distributed among the guns, each with its own clear task. Commands were to be given not by shouting but by signals. It was a mechanism that was well-oiled and ready for action. In addition to the artillery, several thousand French infantrymen and dismounted knights were positioned behind the rampart. Their task was not to counterattack, but to hold the rampart if any of the English managed to survive the artillery fire and reach the fortifications. They were the last line of defense, but Bureau hoped it would not come to that. The French camp was an ideal trap. It looked like a temporary fortification that could be taken by storm. It provoked an attack. Bureau knew Talbot's reputation. He knew that the old lion would not be able to resist the temptation to attack head-on. He did not just build a camp, he created a stage for tragedy, knowing that the main character would not be able to resist playing his part. When Talbot and his vanguard reached the plateau, this is exactly what they saw before them. A long earthen rampart studded with stakes and an eerie silence. There were no signs of flight. On the contrary, French banners flew above the camp, and rows of soldiers were visible on the rampart. Any other commander would have immediately stopped in order to retreat. But Talbot was not just any commander. He had already given the order to attack. Retreating in front of the enemy was tantamount to disgrace for him. Perhaps he still believed that this was a ruse, that only a weak rearguard was hiding behind the ramparts. He decided that his knights would be able to break into the camp on the shoulders of the fleeing enemy. He made a fatal mistake. What if I told you that the greatest battle was lost because of one false phrase? That phrase was, "The French are running." Blinded by it, Talbot gave an order that made no military sense. He ordered his exhausted vanguard, consisting mainly of dismounted knights and archers, to attack head-on a perfectly fortified artillery position. This decision was pure madness from a tactical point of view. The English did not have numerical superiority. They did not have their own artillery to engage in counter-battery fire. They did not have siege weapons or ladders to storm the ramparts. All they had was their courage and faith in their leader, and Talbot threw this priceless resource into the fire. The soldiers, despite their fatigue and the obvious danger, obeyed. They formed their battle lines. At the front were the elite, the knights and lords of Gascony and England. They marched on foot, as it was impossible to attack such a rampart with cavalry. Behind them were the famous English archers, who were to cover the attack with a hail of arrows. Talbot, riding his horse, took up a position to command the battle. He was the only horseman on the field. Ironically, after his previous captivity, he had sworn never again to fight against the French king with weapons in his hands. Therefore, on that day, he was armed only with a hatchet, which served more as a symbol of authority than a weapon. He was a commander, not a fighter, but his presence inspired the soldiers. They advanced across the open field, straight towards the French fortifications. It was a march of several hundred meters under the scorching July sun. English archers began firing arrows, trying to suppress the defenders on the rampart, but their arrows were practically useless. French soldiers and artillerymen were safely hidden behind a thick earthen rampart. In the French camp, Jean Bureau calmly watched the English attack approach. He did not give the order to open fire. He waited. He allowed the English to come closer, within range of a sure shot. His gunners stood by their guns with lit fuses, waiting for a single signal. There was a tense silence in the camp, broken only by the cries of the attackers. The English and Gascon soldiers, seeing that the enemy was silent, may have been encouraged. They may have thought that their determined advance had indeed frightened the French. They quickened their pace, preparing for the final push across the moat and onto the ramparts. They were already very close when the silence was finally broken. Jean Bureau gave the order, and 300 guns spoke at once. This moment became a turning point not only in this battle, but in the entire history of warfare. It was the first massive volley of field artillery in European history against advancing infantry. and the effect was unimaginable. Talbot himself, riding on horseback, was an ideal target and an excellent vantage point. He saw a cloud of smoke envelop the French rampart, and in an instant, his best soldiers, his knights, his veterans began to disappear. How desperate he must have felt when he realized that his bravery had been defeated by mathematics. In the next chapter, we will see what happened when steel met gunpowder. The volley of 300 cannons was unlike anything ever seen before on the battlefield. It was not a single shot from a bombard to which everyone was accustomed. It was a wall of fire, lead, and iron. The cannonballs fired from close range had enormous destructive power. They pierced knightly armor, which was considered invulnerable to arrows or swords. They did not simply stop people, they tore apart the attacking ranks. The front ranks of the English and Gascon nobility, marching in the vanguard, bore the full brunt of this blow. The ranks, which had been orderly a moment ago, descended into chaos. The attackers were stopped as if by an invisible wall. The volley was so dense that it physically prevented the attackers from moving forward. It was not a battle, it was a methodical elimination of the target. But that was only the beginning. The main advantage of the Bureau's artillery was not only its quantity, but also its reloading speed. Its trained gunners worked in unison. No sooner had the smoke from the first volley cleared than the guns were reloaded. The second volley struck the English, who had not yet recovered from the first, and then the third and the fourth. The English archers, the pride of the army, proved completely useless. They could not see their targets through the thick gunpowder smoke that enveloped the French camp. Even if their arrows reached the rampart, they simply stuck into the ground or the logs of the palisade. They could not harm the artillerymen who were safely sheltered. Despite this, the English showed incredible courage. Those who survived the first volleys gathered in groups and continued to advance. They were loyal to their knightly duty and their commander. They managed to reach the moat and even attempted to climb the rampart. They fought desperately, trying to break through the defenses. But here the second echelon of Bureau's defenses awaited them. The French infantry, armed with pikes and halberds, easily knocked down the few who managed to climb the walls. Meanwhile, the artillery did not cease fire, switching to firing grape shot. Small stones and pieces of iron flying out of the barrels acted like giant shotguns, leaving no chance for anyone in the open. The battle, or rather the beating, lasted about an hour. The English and Gascons launched one desperate attack after another, but each one was shattered by a wall of fire and steel. They could not break through, but they did not want to retreat while Talbot was leading them. The losses were catastrophic. The field in front of the French camp was littered with bodies and banners. Talbot himself was at the center of this hell. He rode his horse trying to inspire his men, urging them to advance. He couldn't understand how this was happening. In his world, bravery always won. In his world, a determined attack broke through any defense. But he was confronted with a world where bravery was useless against a precisely calculated trajectory and chemical reaction. The attack faltered. The troops that had been a proud army an hour ago turned into scattered groups of people seeking salvation. They began to retreat, suffering heavy losses. They were completely demoralized. They were not fighting people, but thunder and lightning controlled by an invisible enemy. At that moment, Jean Bordeaux realized that his plan had worked perfectly. The enemy was broken and put to flight, but the battle was not over yet. The French had no intention of sitting behind their walls. They were waiting for only one thing: the arrival of their reserves, which were to deliver the decisive blow. When the French command saw that the English attack had completely failed and their troops were retreating in disorder, the order was given to counterattack. From the flank that had not been attacked by the English, a fresh detachment of Breton cavalry emerged from the camp. These knights had not participated in the defense and were full of strength. They struck the flank of the retreating and demoralized English. This blow was decisive. The English army, already broken by artillery fire, could not withstand the attack of heavy cavalry. A panicked retreat began. Soldiers threw down their weapons and tried to save themselves by seeking shelter in the forest or attempting to cross the river. The battle turned into a pursuit. John Talbot remained on the battlefield. He tried to organize a rearguard, gathering the remnants of his men to cover the retreat. His personal guard and most loyal knights rallied around him. He remained on horseback, refusing to leave the field. At that moment, the French artillerymen, who had spotted the group of horsemen, fired one of their last shots. The cannonball fired from the culverin did not hit Talbot himself. It struck his horse. The animal collapsed, crushing the 80-year-old commander beneath it. Talbot found himself on the ground, immobilized by the weight of his armor and the horse's body. His loyal knights, including his son, Viscount Lisle, rushed to his aid. They surrounded their fallen leader, trying to protect him. But it was too late. They were immediately surrounded by French infantry, which had poured out of the camp after the cavalry. A short and desperate battle ensued. Talbot's son died beside his father while trying to protect him. John Talbot himself, immobilized and helpless, was identified. For the French soldiers, he was a symbol of all the misfortunes that England had brought to their land. The legendary scourge of France was in their hands. His presence on the battlefield was over. The legendary knight, a symbol of a bygone era, was surrounded and his command ended. His banner fell, and with its fall ended not only the battle, but the entire war. The news that Talbot was out of action spread instantly across the field. For the English soldiers who idolized him, it was the final blow. All organized resistance ceased. The remnants of the army were either destroyed, scattered, or taken prisoner. The French victory was absolute and crushing. Jean Bureau, an engineer and accountant, had defeated the greatest knight of his time. He had won without losing many of his men. His artillery had done all the work. He proved that a well-fortified position and massive artillery fire were stronger than any knightly valor. He did not fight by Talbot's rules. He forced Talbot to fight by his own. The English losses were horrific. Nearly 4,000 men, including most of the Gascon nobility, were left on the field. It was not just a military disaster, it was a demographic catastrophe for the region. The entire elite of Gascony, who had believed in Talbot, was destroyed in 1 hour. French losses were minimal. Some sources say they lost less than 100 men. Jean Bureau's artillery park proved to be an impregnable fortress. His plan, based on cold calculation, technology, and knowledge of the enemy's psychology, worked perfectly. It was a triumph of the new era. The Battle of Castillon changed everything immediately. The army that was supposed to save Gascony was destroyed. Its legendary leader was killed. There were no defenders left in Bordeaux. The Gascons had neither troops nor the will to resist. The way was open for Charles VII's French army. A few days after the battle, the French approached the walls of Bordeaux. The city, deprived of any hope of help, was forced to surrender. On October 19, 1453, Charles VII made a triumphant entry into the capital of Gascony. This time, French rule was final and irrevocable. The city lost all its ancient privileges and freedoms. The surrender of Bordeaux effectively marked the end of the 100 Years' War. England no longer had an army in France, nor the money or desire to continue the conflict. The country was rapidly descending into the chaos of the Wars of the Roses and had no time to spare for its lost continental possessions. October 19, 1453, is considered the official end date of the longest conflict in European history. No peace treaty was signed. The war simply ended because one of the sides could no longer continue it. England lost all its possessions on the continent, which it had held for centuries. It retained only one port, Calais, which it would hold for another 100 years. But the great Anglo-French empire of the Plantagenets ceased to exist. For Gascony, it was a tragedy. The region was devastated. Its trade with England was interrupted for many years. Its nobility was destroyed at Castillon. The region lost its unique identity and was forcibly integrated into the French kingdom. It would be decades before Bordeaux could regain even a fraction of its former prosperity, but now as a French city. In military terms, Castillon was a watershed. It was the first battle in open country where victory was achieved solely through the use of artillery. Jean Bureau proved that cannons were not just siege weapons, but a decisive force on the battlefield. He showed that a fortified position protected by artillery was invulnerable to attack by a medieval army. The Battle of Castillon sounded the death knell for knighthood. What could a knight in shining armor, armed with a sword and spear, do against an iron cannonball flying at tremendous speed? His armor became useless. His bravery became meaningless. His head-on attack tactics became suicidal. The era in which the outcome of a battle was decided by the personal valor of aristocrats was over. An era was beginning in which victory was brought by engineers, logisticians, trained calculations, and mass armies. War ceased to be a contest and became a science. Jean Bureau was one of the first scientists of this new terrifying discipline. The symbolism of this battle was enormous. The old 80-year-old John Talbot, the last knight, died by a weapon he did not understand and despised. His conqueror, Jean Bureau, a bourgeois and accountant, did not even draw his sword. It was a change of eras, recorded on a single bloody field. Castillon's legacy shaped the development of warfare for centuries to come. All European monarchs immediately realized the importance of artillery. An arms race began, leading to the creation of increasingly powerful and mobile cannons. Armies became professional, and engineers came to be valued as highly as generals. The Battle of Castillon was one of three great events of 1453. In the same year, the Ottoman Turks, also using powerful artillery, took Constantinople, putting an end to the Byzantine Empire. In the same year, in Mainz, Johann Gutenberg, according to some sources, began printing his Bible. Gunpowder and the printing press were two inventions that destroyed the old world and created a new one. Castillon became a vivid demonstration that the old feudal methods of warfare were obsolete. The knightly cavalry, which had dominated the battlefields for 1,000 years, lost its role. Armor, which had become thicker and thicker to protect against arrows, proved powerless against cannonballs. The entire social and military order of the Middle Ages collapsed. Previously, war had been the preserve of the aristocracy. Only a wealthy feudal lord could afford a horse, armor, and weapons. Artillery changed that. Cannons were expensive, but only the king could afford them. Artillery became the last argument of kings, a tool for centralizing power. It allowed monarchs to destroy the castles of rebellious barons and subjugate them to their will. This led to the strengthening of royal power and the birth of centralized nation-states such as France. The era of feudal fragmentation, epitomized by figures such as Talbot, was becoming a thing of the past. The modern age was dawning, with its absolute monarchies and standing armies. Military tactics also changed dramatically. New types of fortifications were needed. The old, tall, thin walls of castles were ideal targets for cannons. They were replaced by low, thick earthen bastions capable of absorbing cannon fire and serving as platforms for their own artillery. The era of the Italian bastion began, which defined fortification for the next 400 years. On the battlefield, the main force became infantry armed with firearms and pikes, capable of protecting artillerymen. War became more anonymous and much more deadly. It was no longer a duel, it became an industry. Jean Bureau was one of the first managers of this new industry. The symbolic death of John Talbot marked the end of an entire culture. The ideals of chivalry, courtly love, and honor won in combat all began to seem archaic. Of course, chivalric novels would continue to be written for a long time, but as a real military and social force, chivalry was dead. It was not killed by a French soldier, but by an impersonal piece of metal fired along a ballistic trajectory. The 100 Years' War itself, which ended so dramatically, determined the future of England and France. France became a unified, powerful continental state. England, expelled from the continent, became an island power forever. It had to focus on developing its fleet and seeking ways to expand across the seas. The defeat at Castillon may have predetermined the future British Empire. Thus, the Battle of Castillon was not just the end of a long war, it was a turning point in history. It was the moment when the Middle Ages symbolically gave way to the modern era. And it was not done by a king, a philosopher, or an old-school military commander. It was done by an engineer who believed in the power of mathematics and gunpowder more than in the power of a knight's oath. This battle changed the balance of power forever. It showed that technological superiority and the right tactics can completely nullify factors such as personal bravery and experience. The Battle of Castillon became a lesson that European nations learned very quickly as they entered a new era, the era of gunpowder. We saw how the past and the future collided on a single field in France. John Talbot's heroic but reckless attack was the last song of the knightly era. Jean Barrot's methodical, cold, and devastating artillery fire was the overture to a new era, where technology, calculation, and logistics would reign supreme rather than valor. The Battle of Castillon is not just a story about cannons defeating knights, it is a story about how the very paradigm of thinking is changing. It is a reminder that those who are unable to adapt to new realities are doomed to remain in the past, no matter how glorious it may have been. Talbot was the greatest hero of his time, but he was born too late or stayed too long in this world. We would like to know what other great battles or turning points in military history you would like to see on our channel. Perhaps you are interested in the Battle of Crécy, where the bow challenged the knight, or the Battle of Adrianople. Write your suggestions in the comments. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next episodes.